Nous avons le plaisir de recevoir le docteur John Peterson Mayer, expert en sciences de l'environnement, qui s'est fait connaître en 1996 à travers la parution d'un ouvrage qui a fait date, L'homme en voie de disparition, et qui a été consacré aux fameux perturbateurs endocriniens dont on parle beaucoup aujourd'hui. Docteur Myers, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Immense plaisir donc de vous recevoir. La question des perturbateurs endocriniens est aujourd'hui au premier plan de l'actualité. Pourquoi seulement maintenant? Pourquoi a-t-on attendu si longtemps pour en parler?
There are many reasons why we are learning that endocrine disrupting compounds are a serious problem. Just this year, the World Health Organization, WHO, declared endocrine disruption a global public health threat. 20 years ago, they wouldn't have done that. In fact, it was only 20 years ago that we wrote a book, Our Stolen Future, that laid out a series of questions for which we didn't have the answers. That book created a flood of scientific research that has now changed our understanding completely. There are thousands and thousands of scientific papers that have come out in the last 20 years, and they've revealed to us many things we did not suspect.
Alors justement, pourquoi les médias ont-ils attendu si longtemps avant d'en parler? C'est ça la vraie question.
The media are cautious. They can be very cautious about things in science that are controversial. On the one hand, it grabs readers, but on the other hand, they then get criticized heavily by industrial interests that don't want these things talked about. But let me step back and go to your original question of why are we only learning about this now? I said one reason, because we have new science. And it is astounding new science, science we couldn't have dreamed of 30 years ago. The second reason is because since about 1900, the year 1900, tens of thousands of chemicals have been added to commerce. These are chemicals that are novel to human body chemistry. We've never had experience with them as organisms. We don't know how to deal with them. And some percentage of them are endocrine disrupting compounds. So there's been this flood of new chemicals coming into commerce. But the key thing here is that often it takes decades for an effect to be observed in an individual that was exposed in the womb. So by definition there, you've got a 50-year lag time. Exposure in the womb, effect in middle age, late age. Just as one example, this week, a study was published showing that people with Alzheimer's disease are much more likely to be exposed, to have been exposed early in their lives, decades ago, to DDT. Now, DDT, that's a compound we've been studying for 60 years, and we're only right now discovering its potential link to Alzheimer's, which is a modern epidemic.
C'est donc une question de visibilité. Aujourd'hui, les gens savent parce que les choses sont plus visibles. On parle des produits de consommation, on parle d'enquêtes qui sont faites sur le plan médical. C'est ça la raison.
The way that products are brought to market, the way they've been traditionally brought to market, requires no chemical testing for most types of compounds. And so over this 100-year time period, with new chemicals being invented all the time, almost 80,000 of them over that 100-year time period, they're put into products, they're led into commerce, and yet no one's tested whether or not they're safe. And we have to wait for scientists like me, or epidemiologists, or people who study public health, to suddenly realize, wait a second, there's a cluster of diseases here, people are getting sick there, Alzheimer's disease is becoming more common, and then we have to back up and begin to ask a whole series of scientific questions that can take decades to help us understand what's actually happening.
C'est donc un mouvement qui est très lent et qui aujourd'hui est au premier plan et qui inquiète les gens.
It has been slow movement, but it's moving much more rapidly now. The US government, the European countries' governments, the Japanese government have put hundreds of millions of dollars into this research. And that's what has led to this flood of information. And we're learning that the way we used to think about toxicology has many flaws, many flaws. Probably the most important three for us here are, first, the effects can take place at much lower levels than anyone imagined, parts per billion. infinitesimally small levels. Second, the most vulnerable part of human life is in the womb. It's in the womb. And that's where those parts per billion levels of chemicals really matter. But the effects may not be visible until much later in life. So those are two of the key pieces of this science. The third is that we've always thought we could establish what's safe and what's not by testing one chemical at a time. But none of us are exposed to one chemical. We all, you and I, if we were to get our blood drawn today, we'd find certainly several hundred industrial chemicals in our blood. And if that's a pregnant woman's blood, there'll be just as many. And we used to think that the placenta protects the fetus. It doesn't. It doesn't protect the fetus. So here you've got a fetus, someone who's going to become a human being and live a life, being exposed in the womb to hundreds of chemicals which change how genes behave. And that plays out over the lifetime of the individual. So you build in all these delays. First, no one's asking the questions. Second, the effects actually can take decades to develop. And third, the tools that we have used to help us figure out what's safe and what's not just haven't been adequate.
Il y a aussi, je pense, la question des statistiques. Les spécialistes n'ont pas d'anciennes statistiques. Ces phénomènes sont récents, donc je pense que c'est sur le long terme qu'on peut prouver les choses.
Yeah, it is extremely difficult to prove causation in a science like this. Extremely difficult. First of all, easiest would be if we could compare one completely unexposed population with an exposed population. That doesn't exist in the real world. Everyone is exposed, some to more, some to less, to different mixtures. It's incredibly complicated. And so the statisticians who do this work have to have huge sample sizes, cost millions of dollars to do these studies, and they have to, over time, tease out the relationships by using statistical procedures. Right. Now, what they do, because it is so complicated, is they turn to animal research, and we're animals. We have the same hormone systems that mice and rats have, and so we look in those experimentally where we actually can do experiments. We can prove causation in animals. And then we ask, are the patterns we see in people like what we know works in animals? And that's where several lines of scientific evidence come together to help us understand what's causing.
Si l'on revient sur la question du DDT, ce produit dont on a parlé il y a déjà longtemps, beaucoup de gens savent que ce produit est dangereux. Et pourtant, on a attendu avant d'avérer cette question, de la mettre aux yeux du public. Pourquoi attendu si longtemps concernant ce produit qui était connu?
It has taken us a long time to discover the links between DDT and Alzheimer's disease. But in fact, there's a long history of research on DDT and other types of effects. Many of them take years to develop, and it turns out there are ways, there are old blood banks that we can go back to and we can find out how much a woman was exposed during pregnancy and then look at the health of her fetus as that fetus grew into a baby, grew into a young woman, and lived out her life. And we're learning from studies like that that DDT is linked to infertility and to breast cancer. Women who are exposed to DDT before they entered puberty are much more at risk to DDT than a woman who never was exposed prior to puberty. But it turns out having access to blood banks that were stored 50 years ago and the health records of a 50-year-old woman who was in the womb at that time, that's very tricky and unusual science. So it's incredibly difficult to do this work. Fortunately, we have people who are dedicated, they've stuck to it, they've found unusual opportunities because of stored blood or whatever, and they are now revealing things we did not even imagine might be true.
Alors, vous, personnellement, comment avez-vous approché, traité ce problème des statistiques? Comment avez-vous analysé ça?
Well, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I don't analyze big data sets, okay? But what I do is I try and help the epidemiologists understand what animal experiments are telling them. So you do experiments with animals, also with human cells. It's another important line of evidence because we're focused here on the molecular mechanisms, the way that that chemicals interfere with the turning on and off of genes. That's the core mechanism at work here. So what people in this field have to do is they have to take evidence from human cell experiments. They have to take evidence from animal experiments. They then have to predict what they should see in people with statistical observations. And if this is consistent with this, is consistent with that, then you start to think, oh, I've got a result here that's really important. So, but to do all those three types of experiments, the observational ones with statistics, the cell ones, the experimental ones, it takes a long time.
Et vous tirez des conclusions à partir de ça. Alors, il y a une question que je trouve assez importante. On sait que les chercheurs américains, la science américaine, d'une manière générale, a toujours été en avance, en tout cas jusqu'à maintenant. Quelle est la situation aux États-Unis par rapport à ces problèmes?
Well, something very important happened about 5 years ago. There's a medical society called the Endocrine Society. And this has 15,000 members worldwide. They are the world's experts on hormone-related diseases, diseases of the endocrine system. If you're suffering from a hormone-related disease, these are the people you want to go to have help in getting well again. So about 5 years ago, they began to issue public statements saying, we believe endocrine disruption is a big public health threat. And it's our responsibility as the experts on hormones to take the leadership in this. So there have been several other scientific societies who have joined the Endocrine Society. In essence, what they're saying, they're saying that the agencies responsible for assessing safety don't know how to deal with hormones. They don't know that science. And they actually published a statement saying, FDA in the US or EPA in the US, if you want help in understanding this science, come to us and we'll help you. They are the Endocrine Society members are the world's expert in this type of science.
Dernière question sur ce sujet. La situation sanitaire de la population américaine n'est pas bonne. On le sait. Est-ce que vous faites un lien direct avec ce que vous venez de nous expliquer?
If you talk to any public health expert in the US or actually worldwide, they will tell you that today's children, the kids today, are less healthy than their parents were.
In US?
Not just the US, all around the world. Less healthy than their parents were. This may be the first time since the Black Death when that's been true. And the reason is this generation of kids is beset by several epidemics of hormone-related diseases. Things like type 2 diabetes, like heart disease. Like as they grow up, many are infertile. They develop breast cancer or prostate cancer. These diseases, which have become epidemic, especially in the U.S., as the leader, the U.S. always leads, in this case it's pretty bad, these epidemics have undermined the health of the next generation. And we know from multiple sources of science that endocrine disrupting compounds are very likely to be contributing to each of those health effects. Not just the ones I just mentioned, but also immune system disorders. A hyperactive immune system leading to autoimmune diseases, or a hypoactive immune system leading to an inability to resist infectious agents. The immune system matures because as it gets signals carried by hormones. Hormones control immune system development. So if you have something interfering with that process, you have immune system problems. So here you have this unprecedented situation. Today's kids are less healthy than their parents. And we think that paying attention to endocrine disruption will allow us to make people healthier.
Okay, thank you for this first part.
Okay.